Before I did anything to the body, I wanted to check whether the pickups fit properly, and guess what? They didn't. The single coils had an unevenly cut plastic base, which was a few millimeters wider than the routed cavity. Rather than expanding the cavity, I chose to file down the extra plastic. One of the pickups was so uneven that I had to cut down the excess with a knife before moving on to files and then sandpaper. Next up was the carving. The body already had a slight belly cut and an arm contour. I usually like these features, but on this guitar they were placed on the wrong side for me. I traced some contours using a pencil to get a general idea of the final shape. I couldn't make the arm contour as deep as I would have liked, because the control cavity was right below the surface, and I ran the risk of cutting into it. Because of this, the whole section ended up looking more like a rounded corner than a proper forearm contour, but that's fine. I also marked an area where the neck meets the body to create a recess similar to what PRS does on their guitars. Once I was happy with the overall shape, I used a pocket knife to carve the body, making sure to stay within the lines and always cut thin strips. This was the most satisfying part of the project so far. Cutting into wood just feels good for some reason, and if I ever build a guitar body from scratch, I would rather use manual tools than electric alternatives. I try to cut along the grain rather than into it, which can often result in splits or chipping. Here's what that looks like. I used a regular file to very roughly smoothen any hard edges. This is where the whole process starts to turn into a mess, and a good vacuum cleaner becomes useful. I moved on to very coarse sandpaper, stuck to a flat sanding block. The first one I tried was extremely abrasive and only took a few passes to start visibly reshaping the wood. I was afraid of taking too much excess off, so I replaced it with a slightly finer 400 grit sandpaper. For the final pass I used 1000 grit, and this made the wood smooth enough that I probably could have applied a stain or an oil finish and be done with it. However, I don't think the wood in this guitar looks particularly nice, so I settled on the original plan of painting over it. The humbucker cavity was also problematic. It had the correct dimensions, but the rounded corners had a larger radius than the pickup. I had to do some additional trimming with a knife in order to get the pickup to fit. This is all hidden away under the pickup cover, so I didn't bother too much making it look good. I covered all cavities using masking tape and trimmed the excess with the razor blade. The only part that actually matters is the neck pocket, because any layer of primer or paint can change the way the neck fits onto the body. I decided to cover everything else too, because I think it looks cleaner. This might come back and bite me later. I don't know how risky it is to leave wood exposed to the elements, but in the worst case I'll get back to it later and seal the wood with conductive paint. which should also help with shielding. Choosing a primer was overwhelming at first, because I had no idea what to look for. I had to do a bit of research and got the most information out of 2 YouTube channels. The first one is Brad and Go's channel, and the other one is Crimson Guitars. I settled on a Myocolor basic wood primer, after first making sure that it's compatible with acrylic-based paint. I improvised the painting both out of a large cardboard box and a wire coat hanger. I wanted something that allowed me to rotate the guitar and get access to all possible angles. Most of the resources I found recommend around 3 layers of primer, or possibly more if they're thinner. I aimed for the same number. Admittedly, I was actually trying to use up an entire 400ml can and then add more if needed. I waited for 10 minutes in between coats and made sure to have a well-ventilated area. I covered everything around the booth with a protective sheet of plastic. The cardboard box did a relatively good job keeping the primer from getting everywhere, but towards the end of the process I could still notice a thin layer on the plastic sheet, which looked similar to dust. In the future I would do this outdoors if I had access to a backyard or a garage. Once the body was dry enough, I flipped it around and added some more primer on the bottom. The wood fiber was still slightly visible under the initial coats. In the end, the surface looked relatively smooth. I wet-sanded everything with 400 grit sandpaper to fix some uneven spots. I was careful not to apply too much pressure or go over the same area too many times, and I still managed to sand through the primer in a few places, so I decided to go back and apply a few more coats off camera. This time I was more liberal with the spray can. I sprayed the problematic areas several times and accepted the possibility of drips. I was also too impatient and accidentally brushed over a wet section, which took a few more coats to repair. This time I used 1000 grit sandpaper for wet sanding, and only insisted on the spots that had drips. I stopped as soon as the drips were mostly blended into the surrounding area. By this point I had already spent a few evenings doing nothing but applying coat after coat of primer and waiting in between, so I decided the result was good enough for painting.